just think you're doing such a fabulous job with the Consortium News. You really have brought this front and center, and you got a lot of imaginations. You get the assistance of Elizabeth. You're literally on a full-time basis.
Yeah. On second thought, we'll keep you on for about an hour to keep going on that theme about Consortium News.
Hi, I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. Consortium News was founded in 1995 by the late investigative reporter Robert Perry, who was tired of his stories being suppressed by his editors at the Associated Press and Newsweek. Bob began Consortium News as a place for a consortium of journalists to publish their work that the corporate media wouldn't allow. The website is now approaching its 25th birthday. In that quarter century, the world's first independent news site is dependent on the generous support of its readers. For 25 years, they have given us a vote of confidence by keeping us going. Consortium News remains committed to its core mission to bring you nonpartisan news and analysis you won't get from a mainstream media that suppresses or misses stories or angles threatening to establishment interests. Consortium News has now moved firmly into the times with the launch last July of CN Live. With just 11 episodes of the webcast so far, CN Live is making its mark on the web with its unique long-form video journalism that dives deep beneath the surface of the crucial issues of our day. Nat Perry, a son of our founder, said this about CN Live. Congratulations on the CN Live initiative. It looks great, and it's something I'm sure my dad would be pleased with. I know he always wanted to do more in terms of video. In both print and on the screen, we've been bringing you the best coverage to be found anywhere about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, as well as incisive analysis of the Middle East, Europe, Asia, domestic US politics, and the media. Bob Perry and many of our writers were in the forefront of debunking the Russiagate conspiracy theory long before it was put to rest by Special Counsel Robert Mueller's failed investigation. But all this takes money, as we pay our writers, editors, and video production and administrative staff. We maintain our fierce independence because we rely only on our readers' and viewers' generosity. So please dig down deep to help support the continuation of Bob Perry's unique project. Consider making a generous contribution during our fall fund drive. Please go to our website, consortiumnews.com, and click on the red donate button on the upper right side of the page. Thank you.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to episode 12 of CN Live. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
On tonight's program, we devote the entire show to Saudi Arabia, following a PBS Frontline investigation to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his interview with CBS 60 Minutes this week. We'll be delving in depth into aspects not treated by those mainstream reports, namely the history and complexities of U.S.-Saudi relations, as well as Saudi-Israeli relations, and the domestic political scene inside the kingdom. Our guests who discuss this topic are activist Medea Benjamin, analyst Giorgio Cafiero, and Saudi journalist al-Ahmed. But first, the headlines.
Julian Assange's father said that his son, the publisher of WikiLeaks, is being held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day in Belmarsh prison. Assange is being held only on an extradition request from the United States on charges under the Espionage Act of possessing and publishing classified information, the first journalist to ever be so charged. This week, British MP Chris Williamson wrote to the Home Secretary explaining that Julian Assange's ongoing detention is unjust and reiterated the point that the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has been making for years in requesting Assange be freed.
Donald Trump has asked China to investigate why Chinese investors gave $1.5 billion to a hedge fund managed partly by former Vice President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. This is after Trump suggested to the Ukrainian president that he investigate Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden for what Biden openly bragged was a bribe to get Ukraine to fire the prosecutor looking into the company on which Hunter was installed just months after a US-backed 2014 coup in Kiev. While Trump may have good reason to want Joe and Hunter Biden investigated, these are matters usually left to the nominally independent Justice Department. Trump's direct involvement in the matter has only heightened the mania surrounding calls for his impeachment. Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has begun proceedings into that impeachment without going through the formal House floor vote required by the Constitution and putting the inquiry under the House Intelligence rather than the House Judiciary Committee, where impeachment is normally investigated.
The New York Times is peddling a theory to destroy what it says is a false conspiracy theory that CrowdStrike, the private company hired by the Democrats to investigate who allegedly hacked the DNC computer before the 2016 election, was hiding the truth about who was behind the so-called hack. The Democrats refused to allow the FBI to look at the server. The Times reports as a flat fact that Russia carried out the hack, though there is only an indictment of Russian agents and no conviction in a case that will never be tried in court. The Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS, concluded in a study that such a hack from Russia was not physically possible. In his phone conversation with the Ukrainian president, Trump asked whether anyone in the country knew of the whereabouts of the server.
Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has told both CBS 60 Minutes and PBS Frontline that he ultimately takes responsibility for the murder and dismemberment of Saudi writer Kamal Khashoggi a year ago this week, though the Crown Prince in his interview said he knew nothing about when it happened. The PBS documentary takes a critical view of bin Salman, but let's stand the statements that the Houthis in Yemen were Iranian-backed from the beginning of the war, which experts in the region say is not true, as well as other statements that the U.S. was taken off guard by the Saudis' attack against Yemen. This is highly unlikely given the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and the fact that the U.S. has provided logistical support for the unprovoked attack on the region's poorest nation.
We begin our show this evening with Medea Benjamin, a prominent Washington activist who has written a book about US-Saudi relations and has lacked no courage whatsoever in making her feelings known about it in very public places.
Obama, don't meet with the war criminals. Don't do business with the bloody Saudi monarchy. Stop the bloody regime in Saudi Arabia. Stop the killing in Yemen. Stop the killing in Yemen. The Saudi regime is killing women and children in Yemen. Stop the bloody Saudi monarchy. The Saudi regime has blood on its hands. The Saudi regime has blood on its hands. Stop the killing. Stop the killing in Yemen. Stop the Saudis from killing in Yemen. Stop the Saudi killing in Yemen. Stop the killing in Yemen. Stop the Saudi monarchy. It represses its own people. It represses women. It spreads extremist ideology. Stop the Saudi regime. Stop the bloody Saudi regime. Don't do business with Saudi Arabian monarchs. They crush the democracy movement in Bahrain. They deal with the bloody Egyptian coup regime. They don't let women drive. They don't give women equal rights. They repress bloggers and human rights activists. Free Raif Badawi. Stop the bloody Saudi regime. Shame on all of you. Shame on all of you.
We're looking now in depth at the relationship between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and joining us to do that is Medea Benjamin. She's co-founder of Code Pink for Peace and author of several books, including Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. Medea Benjamin, welcome to CN Live.
Nice to be on.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to begin by just setting some historical context between the relationship between the Saudi Kingdom and the United States. It was 3 years after Great Britain, which created Saudi Arabia, recognized the kingdom, that the U.S. in May of 1931 also extended diplomatic recognition to Saudi Arabia. And at the same time that that happened, excuse me, the Saudi King Saud granted a concession to the US company Standard Oil of California. That allowed them to explore for oil in the country's eastern province. At the same time of recognition, there was an oil deal. The company gave Saudi Arabian government 35,000 pounds and also paid assorted rental fees and royalty payments for that concession. It was only 3 years later, in 1938, that Standard Oil actually struck oil in Saudi Arabia. And then in 1944, they changed the company's name to Aramco. In 1950, the Saudis demanded a 50-50 split in profits, which they got. The oil companies then got tax allowances from the US government to make up for that added profit they were giving to Saudi Arabia. In 1988, Saudi Arabia nationalized the oil company, calling it Saudi Aramco, which now is about to be put up for an initial public offering. The US only sent their ambassador to Saudi Arabia in 1943, several years after recognizing it. That year, on 16 February 1943, President Roosevelt declared, quote, that the defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States, and therefore he made the Lend-Lease program extended to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Roosevelt met, of course, very famously with King Abdulaziz on the USS Murphy in 1945 in the Suez Canal, and at that meeting they formally solidified the relationship between the two countries. Saudi Arabia had agreed to remain neutral during the Second World War, but they allowed the Allied powers to use their airspace. In 1951, the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement was signed between the two countries, which allowed the US to trade arms to Saudi Arabia and to have a US military training mission centered in Saudi Arabia. This is the beginning of the long relationship of arms deals between the US and Saudi Arabia in exchange for oil. That is basically the relationship. It carries on till today, with the Trump administration have concluded with the Saudis the largest arms deal in history. There was a bump in the road, however, in 1973, when King Faisal said that Saudi Arabia would take part in the oil embargo because of the 1973 war with Israel. And that caused the US and the Saudis to rupture to some extent. But a year later, the oil embargo was ended, and the US and Saudi Arabia started signing military contracts again, as much as $2 billion in 1975. During the Cold War, US worked with the anti-communist Saudi Arabia to sponsor jihadists in the region for regime change, and the relationship continued through the 1980s in the Afghan war and the so-called war on terrorism, including in Syria and Libya, regime change operations where, again, Saudi and other Gulf Arab monarchies with the US have supported extremist groups. Medea, I want to ask you, given this history, where do we stand now in terms of the US-Saudi relationship? We saw nearly a break, the biggest bump perhaps, the 1973 oil embargo with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but what has been the real fallout from that? Where do we stand now?
Well, as you said in the history, the beginning of the relationship in many years revolved around oil. Now the United States does not need Saudi oil, but it does want to control access to Saudi oil and the global oil supply in general. But since the flow of tremendous amounts of petrodollars into the US economy, the US has a relationship now that depends a lot on the hundreds of billions of dollars that the Saudis invest in the United States in all sectors of the US economy, including US Treasury bonds. There's tremendous amount of Saudi money in the high-tech sector. And then on top of that, as you mentioned, there is the purchase of US weapons. That has become very big business in the United States. Donald Trump touts it as an important source for US jobs, and thinks that that is more important than punishing Saudi Arabia for the death of Jamal Khashoggi. There is, of course, the Saudi participation in the war in Yemen that has been so devastating for Yemen, but where the US has supplied the weapons for doing that. These weapons we supply to Saudi Arabia don't just sit in some warehouse. They're being used to kill Yemenis every single day. The death of Khashoggi now a year ago did put a crimp in that relationship, in that businesses were, for a short time, worried about how it looked to be dealing with such a repressive regime. But since then, many of those businesses have gone back to working with Saudi Arabia. There is a big business gathering that happens every year that will be going on at the end of October
Last year, a lot of businesses decided not to go. This year, it looks like many of them will be going back again.
Thank you again for joining us. And I just wanted, that leads me to my first question, which is regarding the coverage of Khashoggi's murder. And I wanted to ask you what impact that coverage has on the public's perception, especially in the United States, of the situation in Yemen and other aspects of the Saudi regime's policies, including women's rights and LGBT rights in Saudi Arabia. Are those subjects drowned out by the coverage of Khashoggi's murder, or does it kind of bring new light to them? Does it bring a new spotlight onto those subjects as well, in your opinion?
I think it actually brings new light to them, because before Khashoggi murder, you had this very, very repressive country that really did not get scrutiny. What got scrutiny was Iran, because the US narrative was that Iran is the biggest exporter of terrorism in the world, and that we need our Saudi allies to fight against Iran. After Khashoggi's murder, there has been more attention to the fact that the same crown prince that was supposed to be a reformer, in fact, is increasing the repression internally in the country, cracking down on the very women activists who fought for the right to drive, which he is credited for, quote, giving women, cracking down on any dissidents. So I think in that sense, there is more scrutiny for these other abuses in Saudi Arabia that were totally glossed over before Khashoggi's murder.
Did you have any thoughts on the sort of non-answers that MBS gave on the subject of the women, the female activists that are imprisoned in Saudi Arabia, when he was asked about that recently on the 60 Minutes interview?
Well, he gave a ridiculous answer that, oh my goodness, what are these allegations of women being tortured? I'll have to look into that. You know, he is the one who ordered these women to be imprisoned. He knows very well what has been happening to them, because it happened exactly at the same time that he announced that women would have the right to drive. He took those women, some of whom had fought for decades, and put them in prison, sending a very clear message to women all over Saudi Arabia: don't ask for any reforms. I am the one who will ask, who will give them to you. In fact, when women were fighting for the right to drive, they were also fighting for much broader reforms that would be an end to what's called the guardianship system, where women from the day they're born to the day they die have to have a male relative who is in charge of the most important aspects of their lives. This is something that was also eased up by the Crown Prince recently, but certainly the guardianship system was not lifted, and the women who fought for an end to it are still in prison.
So as Joe described a moment ago, you know, the historical US relationship with Saudi Arabia, you know, and we know that that historical support has been championed by both the Democrats and the Republicans when they've been in the White House. You know, what would it take, in your opinion, to see the US actually sever its support of Saudi Arabia, or would that ever be possible given the role of the petrodollar in ensuring the US's global, you know, control? It's basically its empire.
Well, if you had asked me that question perhaps a little over a year ago, I would say maybe something spectacular, like a Washington Post journalist being lured into a Saudi consulate and chopped up with a bone saw, and then his bones melted down with the chemical, and it traced back to the Crown Prince. Well, actually that did happen, and it didn't sever the relationship. So I have no idea at this point. It's not going to be President Trump, because obviously if this didn't do it for him, I can't imagine what will. But there is an interesting change in the relationship, and that is that after the September 14th attack on the Saudi oil facilities, the Houthis having claimed the responsibility, but the Saudis and the US blaming Iran, there was no real retaliation on the part of the United States. Yes, they sent 200 more troops to the region and more war material, but there was so far no military attack, and the US has been relatively quiet on that. And so I think that sends somewhat of a message to Saudi Arabia: don't count on us to jump in and fight a war with Iran for you. So far, it looks like the Trump administration does not want to get itself into a war with Iran on behalf of Saudi Arabia or Israel, for that matter.
That's so fascinating, considering and in context of those historic arms deals that Trump did sign with Saudi Arabia. But your discussion of Khashoggi leads me into my last question before I hand it back to Joe. I just wanted to ask how you would compare or, basically contrast the media, especially Western media's response to Khashoggi's death, its coverage of his death, with the lack of coverage and the basically, propaganda in response to the imprisonment and the continued persecution in the West of journalist Julian Assange.
It is quite remarkable that there is so little coverage of not only the follow-up of Khashoggi's murder, because there has been nobody that has been held accountable for this. The trials started in January, have been dragging on. The Saudis won't even release the names of who is on trial, but we know that the mastermind of this is Mohammed bin Salman himself, and that is according to the CIA as well as the United Nations. And we also know that there has been very little coverage of the women that are in prison, the bloggers that are in prison, the human rights lawyers that defend these activists who are in prison, the Shia minority who are constantly being discriminated against. It's interesting, there's a big initiative on the part of the Trump administration around freedom of religion. In fact, it seems like religion is the only human rights issue that this administration cares about, and that might be a bone that has been thrown to Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo. But when they have these international gatherings to focus on freedom of religion, the perhaps worst place in the world that is not talked about is Saudi Arabia, where there is absolutely no right to practice a religion other than Islam. And in fact, even the Shia minority are discriminated against. It's illegal to have a church. Certainly would be illegal to have a synagogue or to openly practice Judaism or Catholicism. And yet this human rights violation is not even brought up by this administration. So there are all kinds of human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. And I did mention that the US portrays Iran as the largest exporter of terrorism, but really Saudi Arabia is much more culpable. Let's not forget that 15 of the 19 hijackers at 9/11 were Saudis, yet Saudis were not put on the Muslim ban, and that Saudi Arabia continues to export its perversion of Islam called Wahhabism, and that even the textbooks used inside Saudi Arabia, which the United States has been saying year after year since 9/11, you must stop using textbooks that portray non-Muslims as heretics, and yet they continue to use those kinds of textbooks. So the US not only doesn't publicize, but doesn't try to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for any of these violations.
They didn't even throw the Saudis a bone sore, let alone a bone, when it comes to that religious issue. I mean, I spent 3 days in Jeddah, and the thing that lasted memory is looking at a bank and a fast food joint and seeing male entrance on one side and female on the other, and the discrimination reminiscent of the South in the days of segregation here in the U.S. Elizabeth asked you about Julian Assange. Now, the Western media, corporate media, for the most part, says that, like the government, he's not a journalist, okay? And clearly he is. He's a publisher, and he not only publishes material, but he speaks and writes about it and understands it and analyzes it. That makes him a journalist in my book. But the Khashoggi was not really a journalist. He was a propagandist for the regime through many decades, going back to the 1980 war in Afghanistan. But what happened was he fell out. His prince, who was sponsoring him, fell out with Mohammed bin Salman when bin Salman arrested those princes and other members of the royal family into five-star hotels for a while, confiscated a lot of their wealth. He was purging when he took over. So Khashoggi then became persona non grata, and he came to the U.S. Yes, he wrote mildly critical articles of Saudi Arabia. No one could defend in any way what happened to him. But you have to wonder why our beautiful liberal corporate media does not get upset about Julian Assange being arrested. They didn't really get upset about the slaughter going on in Yemen. They didn't really get upset about other things, maybe the women's issue to some extent. But when one of their own is killed, that's when they snapped into action and caused an unbelievable reaction in Congress, which I also wanted to talk about.
Yes, it is quite remarkable that the Saudis could get away with war crimes on a daily basis in Yemen with US complicity, and that didn't seem to bother people in Congress, particularly the Republicans. You know, I spend a lot of time in Congress. I would go to the hearings all the time and be pleading with the members of the Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Relations Committee, do something about Yemen. People are dying every single day. We would take in pictures of starving babies and get arrested for holding them up. But it didn't touch the hearts of these cold-hearted people in Congress until, as you said, one of their own, a Washington Post journalist. And to Washington Post's credit, although I hate to credit them for very much, they did continue and have continued to write article after article after article about Khashoggi. And so people were reading about it, and the Inside the Beltway mafia in Congress was reading about it. And people like Lindsey Graham, who have been great supporters of the Saudis, of the Saudi-led war in Yemen, suddenly, as he said, got pissed off. He said this guy was a wrecking ball, Mohammed bin Salman, and he turned around. And because of people like him, we did manage to get votes passed through both the House and the Senate calling for a cutoff of US support to the Saudi war in Yemen. It is quite remarkable that it took the death of Khashoggi to do that. Now, of course, Donald Trump used his veto power to veto those bills, and Congress is trying through other means, such as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, to try to force his hand. But the war hawks in Congress, several of them, did a turnabout, and because of that, we have had some successful votes in Congress on this. Now, I don't say that this was a vote to cut off all weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, only a minor portion of them, and these same people will go back very soon to embracing Saudi Arabia once there is something that they can use as accountability. Maybe when these trials end and somebody's head is chopped off for this. But in the meantime, there has been a very large coalition of human rights groups, peace groups, humanitarian organizations that has put enough pressure on Congress to get us this far.
Now, this legislation, let's say it carries over to the next Congress and we have a new president. Where do some of the Democratic candidates stand on Yemen and financing that, do you know?
Well, they're tired of this war, and they are tired of the UN saying that the US might be complicit in these war crimes. And there is, as I said, quite a coalition. You know, when I mentioned the groups as part of the coalition, I failed to mention that it's a left-right coalition, that there are many groups who are part of the libertarian community, Republican groups that are financed by the Koch brothers, Freedom Works, they're part of this coalition. The American people don't want the US to go into another war in the Middle East, and they're tired of the ones that exist. When there were polls done asking Americans how they would feel about the US intervening militarily in the Middle East on behalf of Saudi Arabia, only 16% of the American public was in favor of that. So I think with the new president, we would be able to stop the support for the war in Yemen.
In his interview in 60 Minutes, bin Salman talked about, he actually said he did not want war with Iran, and he hoped that there could be some diplomatic resolution. But of course, he was ready to go to war if necessary. But he said it would cause the collapse of the world economy. That's all correct. But he called that attack that they blame, that Saudis and Pompeo, etc., blame on Iran, but that the Houthis took responsibility for. He said that that was Iran being stupid. And Pompeo, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, said it was an act of war. Now, that is a stupid remark. And I say, why? Because, yes, it was an act of war in the middle of a war. They conveniently have excised out the Yemen war that Saudi Arabia started. Sometimes you have to see who started it, right? And in this case, Saudis clearly started it. They started it, as I wrote, based on a scoop that I had from the UN Special Envoy at the time, Jamal Ben Omar, that Saudi Arabia was worried that he was too close to a deal. And they could not allow anything looking like democracy with 30% women in the parliament to exist on their own peninsula, let alone in the whole region, let alone on their own peninsula. So they went to war. They started that war. This attack on the oil installations was a punch in the nose to the guys who started this war. And I think it's interesting. You say that they may not go to war in response. And I think it's because they realize, and that Iranians realize they can get away with this counterattack through the Houthis. Because they are powerless, the US and Saudi Arabia, to start this war that they know will be devastating for all sides. Is that what you think as well?
The Iranians have been preparing for a war with the United States for many years. They have the logistical capability of attacking US bases that surround Iran. That includes bases in Iraq, bases in U.S. forces in Syria, U.S. forces or their allies like the Israelis with their allies in Hezbollah. They also have many allies inside Iraq itself. In Afghanistan, they're able to hit U.S. forces. Also in the Persian Gulf, they are able to stop the shipment of oil, as they have proven. And so whether it's by air, by sea, or by land, the Iranians are prepared. Now, yes, they would get attacked terribly, and it would be awful for Iran as well. But it is awful for Iran right now. The sanctions are devastating, and the U.S. imperial hubris to not only pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, but tell the rest of the world that they can't trade with Iran, is driving Iran to the point of desperation to be doing these kinds of attacks to say, hey, if this is the way you're going to make it, they've even said openly, if you're not going to let Iran sell its oil, then other countries are not going to be able to sell their oil either. So yes, this is started, as you said, the war in Yemen was started with the intervention of the Saudis in an internal affair, but the conflict with Iran was started by Donald Trump, totally manufactured by Donald Trump. And he bit off more than he could chew because the Iranians are prepared to defend themselves.
Indeed, Trump undoing the only really major accomplishment of the Obama administration, the nuclear deal. I want to end by asking you, a writer at Consortium News, in the time of the Khashoggi murder, wrote that this is the end of the House of Saud. It's going to fall. Now, I've been hearing that for a long time. Books have been written about it's going to happen. It's going to happen. I argue that it would not happen, that this would be forgotten for the most part. It would be patched up. And I think I've been borne out to be correct. That has not brought the House of Saud down. However, it is the CIA that says that bin Salman was directly involved in the murder. And you got to wonder about that. Why would the CIA say that? And do you think it's because they wanted to see not Saudi, the House of Saud fall, but bin Salman to fall because he's reckless, he's out of control. They may not be able to control him like they could others. And they preferred bin Nayef, who was previous crown prince, to come back. Do you think that that was what was behind the CIA trying to do this? And they have failed if that's what they wanted.
Absolutely, and I think that, I still think that Mohammed bin Salman is seen as a liability by not only the CIA, but people in the royal house inside Saudi Arabia. I think his days are numbered. They just haven't, his time has not come yet. But I don't think he can continue really as the head of state there when he is so ruthless and so reckless, as Lindsey Graham said, a wrecking ball. So I think we should watch carefully what happens inside Saudi Arabia, and there might very well be some shakeup in the House of Saud, but it is very difficult to predict what happens internally. But remember, when he took about 200 very wealthy individuals and shook them down in the Ritz-Carlton, including not only grabbing billions of dollars, but including things like torture. This guy has a lot of enemies, and I don't think they're sitting by idly. I think there's a lot of coup plotting inside Saudi Arabia, and given that there are still many businesses that are afraid to do business with this crown prince, that this September 14th attack has affected the perception among the financial community about investing in Saudi Aramco. There may well be people inside the royal family who think that their best bet is to push Mohammed bin Salman aside for somebody more, quote, reliable.
Well, we know how shaken up things are when Medea Benjamin is quoting Lindsey Graham positively. So we want to thank you for joining us, Medea, and hope we talk again soon on the ongoing drama of U.S.-Saudi relations. You're watching CN Live.
You're watching CN Live on Consortium News. I'm Joe Loria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss. Join us every Friday from 8 to 10 Eastern Time.
We're streaming through consortiumnews.com.
And on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and DLive.
CN Live.
Your weekly insight into the news.
We're joined now by Giorgio Cafiero, who is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a think tank in Washington, D.C. He's joining us from California. Thank you for joining us to CN Live. Giorgio.
Joe, pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Giorgio recently wrote a piece in Consortium News called The Real Israel-Saudi Relations. We just spoke with Medea Benjamin about U.S.-Saudi relations, and we're now turning to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which is a quite fascinating subject. You know, in 1947, Saudi Arabia was one of the several of the Middle East states that voted against UN partition of Palestine, which created the state of Israel. And Saudi troops were sent amongst the other Arab nations to fight Israel in 48 and also in 1973. But behind the scenes from early on, Saudi Arabia and Israel have had covert relations when they had joint interests. One early example is the 1962 to 70 civil war in northern Yemen, in which Israel backed the Saudis, who were, of course, supporting the Yemeni monarchy against Egyptian-backed rebels who were trying to overthrow that monarchy. Israel, in fact, there was a piece in Politico just a couple of years ago, I was just reading it, said that Israel ran some missions inside Yemen to support the monarchy and Saudi Arabia against the Egyptian troops. There were 70,000 in Egypt. And in your piece, Giorgio, you mentioned this going back to the 1960s as well. Could you fill us in a little on that until we move forward until the current day?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, Saudi Arabia and Israel do not have official diplomatic relations like all of the other Arab Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia never has had official diplomatic ties with Israel. But as you point out correctly, there have been some under the table links between Saudi Arabia and Israel. These links date back decades. However, especially in the last century, the Saudis were always keen to make sure that their contacts with Israel were low profile. Of course, within Saudi Arabia, as well as the Arab world at large, Israel is an unpopular country, and there has been and still is widespread opposition among populations in Arab states to any sort of move toward normalization of relations with the state of Israel. And within that context, the Saudi leadership, at least in the past, wanted to make sure that there was not a lot of publicity surrounding the contacts they had with Israeli officials. What's interesting is that in recent years, the Saudis have been doing quite a bit less to sort of hide the links that the kingdom has with Israel. I think there are a number of changes that have taken place throughout the Middle East and North Africa that have left the Saudi leadership believing that it is in Riyadh's interest to work more closely with Israel and to go to not so much pain to hide this tacit relationship. We see many issues in the region that align Riyadh and Tel Aviv's interests. Many of the analysts who are talking about the Saudi-Israeli relationship point out, incorrectly so, that a shared threat perception of the Islamic Republic of Iran and numerous Iranian-backed groups in the region have been driving this tacit partnership between the Saudi and Israeli governments. That's completely true, but I would add that there are other non-Iran related issues also in play. I think it's important to keep in mind that Saudi Arabia and Israel are basically pro-status quo states in the region. Iran, of course, being an anti-status quo actor in the Middle East, represents what the Saudis and Israelis perceive as a very big threat. At the same time, other groups and movements, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups from the Sunni side of the sectarian division, which are not tied to Iran, are also driving the Saudis and Israelis closer. This has been especially true in the post-2011 period, as the Arab Spring uprisings provided some opportunities for Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups to ascend to power. Of course, when Obama was president of the US, the governments of Saudi Arabia and Israel had a similar perception of how the previous administration was reacting to major changes in the region. Again, when it came to Iran, the Obama White House sought to pursue a partial rapprochement with the Islamic Republic. The Obama administration, in many ways, was rather tolerant of the idea of Sunni Islamists who were democratically elected coming to power. This left both Riyadh and Tel Aviv with the perception of the US kind of retreating from the region, even though that's not exactly the case, but nonetheless, that was a common perception, a belief that the United States was not committed to these two traditional US allies with Obama at the helm. And this left the Saudis and Israelis believing it was in their interest to deepen their cooperation at a time of major change in the region.
Giorgio, what's interesting is that if you ask the man on the street, he would think, of course, that Saudi Arabia and Israel are blood enemies, Arabs and Jews. But in fact, as you're describing, there's been this relationship going on, and it's deepened with in the Obama administration. But now they seem to be less willing to hide that. And I find that interesting. I want to just tell a short anecdote. When I was working at the Wall Street Journal, every year before the UN General Assembly General Debate in September, which we just saw last week in New York, we'd have a conference call with the White House correspondent, with the State Department correspondent, with people from the Middle East around the region, a whole array of the top foreign affairs team at the Wall Street Journal. Of course, I was included as the UN correspondent. And I remember one year I suggested that we looked into a possible piece about the Saudi-Israel relationship, about how it's getting closer and closer. This would have been 2014. Okay, it was 5 years ago. And only the foreign editor was very keen on this. He thought that was a great idea. And then everybody else was silent on the call. And I never heard of that story again. So I never got to do it. I didn't want to do it alone. I wanted to work on it with the people in the region, etc. And I think back in 2014, it would have been quite a bit of news for the Wall Street Journal's audience that this relationship was quite extensive behind the scenes. Today, they're not hiding it anymore. That's my point here. Why is that?
You know, I think this has to do mainly, as I said, with threat perceptions and fears about the ways in which the MENA region is changing. I think probably the Saudi leadership would like to see a Palestinian state exist, but let's be honest, this is not a high priority for the current people, for the people who are currently in charge of the kingdom. I think decades ago, the Palestinian cause genuinely mattered to the leadership in Riyadh, but today, resolving the Palestinian issue is a much lower priority than other issues, such as pushing back against Iran's ascendancy or preventing Islamists from taking power. It's within this context that the Saudis and Israelis find themselves in the same geopolitical boat on a lot of issues.
Yeah, but why are they so brazen about you quote in your article several things that Mohammed bin Salman said and others, and I mean, they're more openly showing the world that they have a common cause. They don't, it seems to me, to be linked perhaps with the Palestinians, because they don't really give a damn. Most of the Arab regimes have been paying lip service to the Palestinians for a long time now. And clearly the Saudis put their relationship with Israel over their relationship and their support of the Palestinians. So why are they being able, why do they feel so confident about talking more openly about this relationship when it could alienate their populations and stir them up against them?
I would argue that the Trump presidency is a pretty important factor here. When Donald Trump was elected in November 2016, many of the leaders in GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council states, were very nervous. Trump was a loose cannon, an unknown variable. He said many things on the campaign trail that were Islamophobic throughout his career. He said many things about the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, or basically free riders, and they need to start paying the United States a lot more for the security protection the American military provides these monarchies. Trump supported the JASTA legislation. So I think the leadership in Riyadh, as well as other GCC capitals, wanted to basically bend over backwards to make it clear to this new and unpredictable and inexperienced administration that these GCC states had Trump's back. One of the ways that they wanted to demonstrate their value to the Trump White House was by saying things about Israel that we had not been seeing in the past. You know, when Mohammed bin Salman very recently was saying, the Palestinians ought to accept the offers for a resolution of the conflict that Israel is offering and that the U.S. is pushing, or they should quote unquote shut up. Frankly, that's music to the ears of administration officials such as Jared Kushner, who would certainly like to see Israel integrate into the region, at least diplomatically, and start to see relationships between Saudi Arabia and others in the Gulf move in a direction toward normalization with Israel.
Building on that subject and what Joe was saying earlier about the fact that the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia has kind of come out from the shadows a little bit. Do you have any insight on specific aspects of that relationship that you think should be covered more by Western press and has been, especially abandoned, that might be of importance?
There's actually an ongoing issue right now that has received a little bit of attention in the global media, but not all that much, and that is Saudi Arabia's anti-Hamas campaign. Beginning earlier this year, around April or so, the Saudi government began detaining a number of Palestinians, Jordanians, as well as Saudis who were residents of the kingdom. Why did they do so? These Palestinians, Jordanians, and Saudis were allegedly linked to Hamas. And according to a number of reports, these people some of them have been tortured, some deported, some have had their financial assets frozen. And I think this is an issue driven by numerous dynamics. But in my opinion, Saudi Arabia's interest in cozying up to the Trump administration even more than it has in the past is one of the factors in play. I think what's going on is the Saudis want to put pressure on Hamas to make more concessions to the Trump administration, as well as Israel, is really a way of having the Saudi government do a really big favor for the Trump administration at a time in which the so-called deal of the century is clearly going nowhere. And we don't even know all the details of this so-called plan. We may never learn the details of this plan. But nonetheless, I think Saudi Arabia's sort of crackdown on alleged Hamas affiliates in the kingdom fits into this picture of the Saudis trying to be seen from the Trump White House's perspective as playing a productive role.
And I hate to add a really broad stroke observation here, but I wanted to have ask for your insight on the potential, I suppose, connection between Saudi Arabia and Israel, not only in terms of their, potential benefit to each other in the favor of the Trump administration, but also the fact that they both seem to have a particular disdain for human rights. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that?
Well, what I would say is that the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, which were driven by numerous factors such as widespread outrage over corruption. Many young people were upset with the extent to which their governments had grown so authoritarian and wanted to sort of push for sort of bottom-up change, grassroots change throughout the Arab world. We saw this, in Tunisia and Egypt, so on and so forth. This really scared the governments of both Saudi Arabia and Israel. Of course, the Saudis had a major concern that the winds of change throughout the region could blow into the kingdom, major implications for the tense situation in the eastern province where Saudi Arabia's oil wealth is concentrated and where the country's Shia minority is mainly based. Also, Israel was concerned not only about Palestinians within the occupied territories and Israel itself taking inspiration from their fellow Arabs in these other states I just mentioned, but they were also concerned about democratically elected governments coming to power in the region and taking a fundamentally different approach to Israel and the Palestine question. Egypt has officially been at peace with Israel since the late 1970s. So for 4 decades, Egypt has not been a confrontational player in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But Egypt's population has had major problems with the peace treaty. Most Egyptians do not agree with their government's position vis-a-vis Israel. A real concern in Israel was that there could be a government in Cairo that would scrap the peace deal and return Egypt to its previous position from the Nasser era and the beginning of Sadat's time as a confrontational actor in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I would just say that both the Saudi and Israeli governments are extremely scared about how, grassroots change could undermine their interests in preserving the regional status quo.
One of the, press focuses in the last few weeks or last few days especially has been the anniversary of the death of Khashoggi. And I was wondering if you could discuss and just hone in on that event a little bit, because I wanted to ask you, what do you think could have driven the Saudi Arabian state to basically participate in such overkill in his death? It's not something where he was simply executed in the way that so many dissidents and others in Saudi Arabia are. It was such a shocking event. Do you have any insight on why that would have taken place, what the motives for that could have been?
Yes, but first of all, to tie this back to the Saudi-Israeli relationship, I encourage viewers to go on Google and look at how Netanyahu responded to the Khashoggi affair. He didn't come out and openly, directly defend the act, but he made it very clear that Mohammed bin Salman is doing positive things as the crown prince, and that it would be unfortunate for this murder case to result in less support regionally and internationally for the crown prince. I think that sheds a lot of light on these issues you raise about concern for human rights and sort of the geopolitics of Israel and Saudi moving closer. Certainly a lot to take away from Netanyahu's reaction. I think today being the 1-year anniversary of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, there's a lot of media attention being paid. Jeff Bezos is over in Istanbul paying respect to the slain journalist. Let's keep in mind that Khashoggi was not a dissident. He was a critic of the crown prince, but he in no way was supporting an overthrow of the monarchy or some sort of democratic revolution in Saudi Arabia. There's certainly a lot of reporting, my opinion, has been very misleading and has led to some people believing that Khashoggi was a dissident. But again, he was just a critic of one prince in Riyadh. And the fact that Mohammed bin Salman, who, according to the CIA and a number of other Western governments, ordered his killing, if this is true, and I think there's, in my opinion, there's every reason to believe it's true, it speaks volumes about the extent to which the Saudi crown prince perceives a huge threat from Saudis living abroad who use media platforms to criticize his leadership. I think this was about sending a message to other Saudis, whether they're in Canada, Norway, United States, that just because you're outside of the kingdom doesn't mean you should feel secure if you're going to go into a public forum and criticize me. And I think that creates a very, very dangerous dynamic and leaves many Saudis who live outside of the kingdom feeling very nervous about the risks that they may have to accept if they choose to write articles that even mildly criticize Mohammed bin Salman.
And yet he told CBS 60 Minutes that journalism is not a threat to the Saudi kingdom. I mean, it's an over-the-top reaction. It might speak of some weaknesses that he might feel, or just complete mania about this. You mentioned Hamas before, and I want to just go a little bit far afield of Saudi Arabia, just to the peninsula of Qatar, because Qatar is a big supporter of Hamas, obviously, and also of Muslim Brotherhood. So what is Qatar-Israel relationship like right now?
Qatar is a unique country in the GCC for many reasons. Qatar has, I would say, with the exception of the state of Kuwait, there's no member of the GCC which is as pro-Palestinian in terms of rhetoric and sort of foreign policy decision-making as Qatar. Qatar raises the Palestinian issue frequently. I think this has to do with Doha's interests in presenting itself as a champion of both pan-Arab as well as pan-Islamist causes in the greater Middle East region. At the same time, Qatar has not been afraid to make overtures to Israel. The Qatari state-owned news network, Al Jazeera, broke ground in the 1990s when they had Israelis on the network. This was extremely taboo for any pan-Arab network. And there are communications between the Israelis and Qataris that do not get a lot of attention, but they are very real. However, Qatar is a supporter of Hamas, and consequently, many Israeli politicians, they frequently rail against Qatar. They describe the emirate as a state sponsor of terrorism. And they use rhetoric that's very, when talking about Qatar, they use rhetoric that's very similar to what we hear from government officials in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Cairo. So to be clear, Qatar has joined other GCC states in terms of moving closer to normalization of ties with Israel, but I do not believe that Qatar would ever consider having official diplomatic ties with Israel unless there is a Palestinian state which is established, has sovereignty, and exists along the 1967 boundaries.
You talk about a formal alliance. I was not aware until your piece that Donald Trump was actually pushing for Israel and Saudi Arabia to have formal diplomatic relations. Is that right? And how's that going?
Well, that is definitely the part of the Trump administration's vision. Realistically, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but there is no doubt that if Israel and Saudi Arabia would have official diplomatic relations, that would definitely advance the interests of Trump and his White House. This would be seen from this administration's perspective as a huge diplomatic victory. The Netanyahu Zionist lobby in the United States would be very excited to see this happen. Of course, for decades, the Arab states have used their collective leverage to put pressure on Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. And going back to 2002 with the Arab Peace Initiative, the Saudi leadership basically said to Israel, if you will give the Palestinians their independent state in line with UN resolutions and the international consensus, every member of the Arab League will normalize their relations with your country. Of course, that never happened, and the Arab states, aside from Egypt and Jordan, never normalized their relations with Israel. Today, in 2019, if Saudi Arabia and other Arab states were to abandon that principle and normalize relations with Israel, regardless of the fact that Israel's made no concessions to the Palestinians, that would change the dynamics completely. And this would end the collective leverage, the collective bargaining power that the Arab states have had for all of these decades. Of course, that is something that officials in the Trump administration, Kushner, Friedman, and so on, it would be a dream come true for them if that would happen.
I was just about to bring up Jared Kushner. I was about to bring up Kushner because he is clearly his family are very close to Benjamin Netanyahu, who apparently stayed in their New Jersey home when he was visiting the New York area over the last decades. And he's supposedly a very close friend of Mohammed bin Salman as well. So he's somebody we have to talk about here when we talk about Israel relations with Saudi Arabia, because he seems to be the point man in between them, between Israel and Saudi Arabia. What role is he playing?
You're 100% right to point out that he and Mohammed bin Salman have a very special relationship. Going back to this topic of Qatar, there was some baggage between his family and Qatar around the time of 2017. There were many people who know a lot about the region who speculated that he actually had a hand in the process of this blockade on Doha beginning. You're 100% right to point out that he kind of is a middleman in many respects between Mohammed bin Salman and the Israeli leadership. But let's be very clear about something. This is not an even-handed, these two relationships are not balanced. While he has good ties with the leadership in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, he is never going to put pressure on Israel in any way that would favor the Arab Gulf states. His loyalty is much more to Israel than it ever would be to the Saudis. And I think officials in Riyadh are aware of that fact. Let's be clear, as long as Kushner and others of his kind are in the administration, this White House will never, ever object to anything that is pushed by the settlers or by the ultra right-wing government in Israel. And I think that if the Saudis were to normalize relations officially with Israel, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But if that were to happen, we can be sure that this would probably come with no concessions from Israel, because Kushner and others in this administration would never put any pressure on Israel to make any sort of concessions, even if the Saudis would like to see that.
You talked before about the Egyptian population being out of sync with its government in terms of its relations with Israel and its support for the Palestinians. That's been my experience many times in Egypt, being amongst the Egyptian people. That is strong. But what about the Saudi population? I mean, at least that says something about Egypt that we can know that. But Saudi Arabia is such a closed down society that it's very hard to get a pulse or a feeling of what the Saudi population is feeling about just about any issue, but including the Palestinian one. Do you have any insights into how the Saudi population would react? Could they react, or how they're thinking now about the Palestinian issue in particular?
It's a very good question. I don't think for your average Saudi, the Palestinian struggle is necessarily a high-ranking issue. That being said, it's misguided for people to conclude that the average Saudi doesn't support the Palestinian struggle. In Saudi Arabia, like all other Arab states, the vast majority of the population would be against any normalization of relations with Israel. We've seen polling done throughout the region, which confirms that. That being said, people in Saudi Arabia do not have any rights to protest or any rights to criticize their government in any sort of meaningful way. So this may be a development, this push toward normalization with Israel that sort of gets imposed on the population. That being said, the leadership in Saudi Arabia is definitely concerned about ways in which a move toward normalization could backfire because the population would have problems with that. All leaders of Arab Muslim countries remember how Sadat's life came to an end in the early 1980s. No doubt that Mohammed bin Salman is probably a little bit cautious about how he approaches this issue of normalization of relations with Israel, keeping in mind the fate of Sadat.
What about preachers, TV preachers? Now, there's some in Qatar, of course, who are openly supporting Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and criticizing Israel. Do we have anything like that in Saudi Arabia?
Sure, but many of those preachers are now behind bars. Many of the religious figures who've criticized Mohammed bin Salman have been silenced. Certainly, and again, I don't think it's going to happen soon, but if the Saudi government would decide to normalize, to move toward official diplomatic ties with Israel, I'm sure that clerics who would speak out against that would be punished very harshly.
I wanted to ask for any insight you might have on the recent MBS interview with 60 Minutes. I'm sure that you've seen that. We've already commented with Medea Benjamin on the non-answers that MBS gave on issues, including the jailing of female activists in Saudi Arabia and that kind of issue. But do you have any specific insights you'd like to add as a takeaway from that interview and what we saw?
Yeah, let's keep in mind that Mohammed bin Salman has this ambitious Vision 2030. This is basically a neoliberal blueprint for ending the Saudis' dependence on oil. This is a vision for growing non-oil sectors of the economy so that Saudi Arabia can maintain its prosperity into the post-oil era. Talking about developing sectors like health, defense, tourism, logistics, so on and so forth. To make Vision 2030 successful, the Saudis have to attract a lot of foreign investment. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi a year ago created a major challenge for Vision 2030 because there were a number of CEOs of major Western corporations that were considering making huge investments in Saudi Arabia. They've had to have second thoughts about doing so because of the PR blowback, not only in the US, but also in other Western countries. So one of the consequences of the Khashoggi saga has been these new challenges to Vision 2030. With respect to this interview you're asking about, and the Crown Prince claiming that although he didn't know about the plans in the consulate and that he didn't order the killing, he still said, I take full responsibility. What this responsibility means in practice is unclear. But I think the reason why he said that was to try to reverse some of the reputational damage that was done in Western countries with the hope of trying to make investors feel more comfortable coming back to the kingdom.
Apparently they are coming back. I think at the end of this month, there's a big investment conference and lots of Western banks, et cetera, have signed up. It does show his reaction to killing this man, the volatility of the Saudi population in a way. Now, they block the internet like most of the Middle Eastern countries do. So I don't know if the Washington Post is blocked in Saudi Arabia. So I don't know whether his articles would have been read in Saudi Arabia, but the fact also, as you mentioned before, that they have imprisoned preachers who support the Palestinians, anything that could rile up a volatile population. If you compare the population of Qatar, for example, 250,000 citizens, all of them rich, everybody else foreign workers, to a Saudi population of millions, and they're not all rich. There's quite a different dynamic between the leadership in Qatar with their population and the Saudis with theirs. So I just wanted to get your insights into that. What I could see now why he would want to shut down Khashoggi if, in fact, it was able to be read in Saudi Arabia, but I don't know if that's even the case.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that Qatar is a small emirate in terms of geography and population size. It is either the richest or second or third richest country in terms of GDP per capita. So there's a social contract between the rulers in Qatar and the citizens, which is very strong. Among native Qataris, as you point out correctly, there's virtually no poverty. When you go to Doha, you do not see poverty in public. However, in Saudi Arabia, the social contract is much more stressed. This is a country where there is real poverty, especially in the eastern province. There is also actual opposition to the government in Saudi Arabia. In Qatar, the only opposition is from abroad, and it's totally fabricated. There's no genuine opposition to the royal family in Doha among Qataris who live in Qatar. So the Saudi government feels much more insecure about regime survival. And this is one of the reasons why there, as you point out, there is much more censorship, much more control of the media in Saudi Arabia compared to Qatar. I want to be very clear, Qatar is no democracy, but the media landscape in Qatar is much more open than it is in Saudi Arabia or many other Arab countries. The leadership in Doha feels more secure when there is an actual debate taking place compared to the leadership, say, in Saudi Arabia or in Abu Dhabi.
We're talking to Giorgio Cafiero about Israel-Saudi relations. And I just wanted to end on this. It's not just Saudi Arabia that Israel's had strange, unusual relationships with, but Iran as well. The Iran-Contra affair. Israel, this was after the revolution, of course, in Tehran. And when the U.S. administration of Reagan wanted to illegally fund the Contras in Nicaragua, they sold arms to Iran, the great enemy of the United States. And they used those proceeds illegally to fund the Contras because the Congress, the U.S. Congress, which alone can appropriate funds, shut that funding off. Who was the middleman in that? Israel. Israel played a huge role in that Iran-Contra deal. In fact, Shrita Parsi, who you probably know, wrote a whole book about this called The Treacherous Alliance, how Israel and Iran have worked together behind the scenes. Could you give us some of your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, you know, when the Islamic Revolution took place in 1979, a new regime was very anti-Western in terms of its ideology came to power. and the leaders of the Islamic Republic were very anti-Zionist in terms of their rhetoric. But it's important to look at actions, not just rhetoric. There was a tacit, I don't want to say a tacit alliance necessarily, but there were overlapping interests between Israel and Iran during the 1980s, at a time when both of these countries perceived Iraq to be #1 threat to both of their countries. The real hostility between the Islamic Republic and Israel began really in the 1990s, after the US-led military campaign of 1991 that severely weakened Saddam Hussein's regime, and then of course the collapse of the Ba'athist order in 2003, when the George W. Bush and Tony Blair administrations decided to invade and occupy Iraq. This led to changes in the geopolitical order of the region that pitted Israel and Iran against each other. And it's within that context that the bilateral relationship has become really hostile. This is contrary to conventional wisdom, which says that the relationship between the two countries was excellent when the Shah was in power, and then it deteriorated as soon as the Shah fell and this new Islamist regime came to power. As you correctly point out, there was cooperation between the two of them in the 1980s when they shared this threat perception of Saddam Hussein.
Well, this discussion not only shows that Israel is a pragmatic nation that will do deals with people who are nominally their enemies, but they're also very much opposed to democracy outside of their own system, including Palestinian Israeli citizens. For example, what you said about the Arab Spring, they would prefer, as you wrote in your piece for us, Israel would much prefer to have these military or other religious or whatever dictatorships, monarchies or otherwise in the region than to have the Arab people have their freedom. And that, it just tells you a hell of a lot right there, doesn't it, Giorgio?
Absolutely. And touching on another article I wrote for you about Israel's role in the Libyan civil war really underscores this point you're making. In Libya, Iran has next to no influence. So this goes to the heart of my point that the growing alignment between Saudi Arabia and Israel is not all about Iran. It's also about countering democratic movements in the region, be them secular or Islamist. In Libya, the Saudi and Israeli governments support General Khalifa Haftar, an ex-CIA asset who is also a dual citizen of the US and Libya. We're not going to go into a huge discussion right now about Libya, but in short, he is trying to create more or less what I would say is a replica of the Sisi regime that we have in Egypt. He'd like to see this kind of political order established in Libya. This is the exact kind of Arab regime that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Israelis would like to see as the model for the Arab world.
Another Libyan dictator without some of the flair and pan-Arab ideas of Gaddafi.
Exactly.
Giorgio, thank you very, very much for joining us. We can go on a lot longer. This is a fascinating conversation. We hope to have you back on again on CN Live.
Joe, thank you so much. Pleasure is all mine.
Okay. We were speaking to Giorgio Cafiero, and you're watching CN Live.
Saudi tourism, an enriching experience.
A promotional video from Saudi tourism. Only a week ago, the kingdom allowed tourist visas for the first time in its history. We'll now turn to domestic politics in Saudi Arabia, and we're joined by Ali al-Ahmed. He's the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs in Washington. He's a journalist, and he's a Saudi dissident. Ali, welcome to CN Live.
Thank you, sir.
Now, Ali, I'll start you off with a very easy question. How did you react to the 60 Minutes interview with Mohammed bin Salman?
The 60-minute interview with Mohammed bin Salman was a setup, a PR attempt to undercut the PBS documentary that was coming 2 days afterwards. So PBS came on Sunday ahead of Jamal Khashoggi's first anniversary, or his murder's anniversary. And we know the fact that this was done very quickly. Corvus arranged for it. This is the second part. This is the second interview with the soft interview with Mohammed bin Salman, with Norah O'Donnell. And it was very clear this was rehearsed and used as a PR campaign to improve the image of Mohammed bin Salman in the United States specifically. And you can see that they have used what we call a window of credibility, him taking responsibility for the murder, but not personally ordering it. It was designed to give Mohammed bin Salman some credibility that he cares about it. So I can tell you from my experience, this was rehearsed, this was made up. It was not an interview. It was mostly like a well-prepared charade to give the Saudis using one of the most credible TV magazines, 60 Minutes, which is over 50 years old, status. And the Saudis give them credit. They have been able to use American journalists and outlets even to their advantage by spreading fake information. And what happened with 60 Minutes is disgrace, the disgrace for journalism.
So what you're saying is it was to preempt the PBS documentary. They knew what happened with the PBS documentary. They were uncomfortable with it. They were worried. So they reached out to CBS to get an interview to air just before it. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I hope that CBS leadership will look into how Norah O'Donnell went to Riyadh, how quickly this was organized. And we know that Norah O'Donnell has friendly relationship with the UAE ambassador. They are friends. The UAE ambassador to Washington, they are friends, and they visit each other, they're family friends. So that has to do a lot with how 60 Minutes did these interviews with MBS. This was really, again, this was a betrayal of journalism. The questions were set up, the answers were prepared ahead of a time, so they just had to kind of go through it and do the takes necessary to get the right answer. It was not, these questions and answers took some rehearsal and several takes, and I hope the CBS management will investigate this entire.
How do you know that they took several takes?
I was a consultant for 60 Minutes in the past, and I worked as a CBS consultant for 6 years, so I know the environment.
So basically, CBS allowed themselves to be used just so they can get a scoop to get out ahead of PBS.
And that is, I think, one of the faults of modern day journalism. You know, access journalism is giving us sometimes fake news.
And Mohammed bin Salman was able to make them wait till 3 a.m., but he also seemed to be quite well trained how to answer and make his eyes look like he's not lying.
Absolutely. I think, like I said, I can tell you from my experience as a person who studied media, understand these nuances, that this was prepared. He was not under stress, and his facial responses, he was comfortable, and these answers, I believe, were prepared by Corvus, Michael Pizzarello, and Adel Jubair. So their questions and answers were all written down, and he just had to rehearse those things.
Oh, that's quite interesting. So they knew how to respond, and they set this up. Did he help his cause with this CBS interview, you think?
I think the interview, because it is in a respectable, supposedly credible TV magazine, it's the oldest TV magazine running on American television. So yeah, I think he helped himself somewhat. I don't think it completely taken or improved his image, but this is a good try and a successful attempt well done, I would say, on their behalf. Of course, because I am an expert, I'm from within the sort of the business, media business, so I can see through it. But most people who have seen it, the public, probably most of them did not see through it.
So a year ago when the murder took place, there was all this talk. Some people were saying, this is it. The House of Saud is going to fall. And of course, we've been hearing that since the 1990s. A very good book by Abarish, the Saudi journalist, the Palestinian journalist, rather, about Saudi Arabia is what I meant. And it hasn't happened. So there was, however, at the time, when the CIA came out and said that he'd done it, he was behind the murder. It appeared that the CIA did not want, of course, the royal family to fall, but to just get rid of him and probably replace him back with bin Nayef. What has happened in that year that has allowed bin Salman to survive?
Bin Salman has the support of President Trump and the support of the UAE ruler and MBZ. The CIA does not have the force on the ground to undo MBS. MBS controls everything. He is the strongest Saudi leader ever in terms of him controlling security and military. They report to him directly, and in terms of controlling the economy and also controlling the Council of Ministers. So he controls basically all facets of power in the country, and he has eliminated any competition. The only competition that the CIA had, it was their favorite son, favorite agent, in fact, MBN, Mohammed bin Nayef, but the guy also has, he was a cocaine addict, and he was CIA proxy. One of the reasons that the CIA was angry with MBS and released and leaked this information because he is not their guy. Their guy was MBN, and when MBS basically managed to overthrow MBN and put him in a box, they were upset. I don't think the CIA has too much right now in terms of ability to unseat him. MBS has no competition within the ruling family, and even if everyone in the ruling family try to conspire against him, they will not be able, because they have no real power. They don't have, none of them have military type group, or they don't have any influence in the army or in security forces. And because of that, it's done. You can say this is a decisive win for MBS, and his personality as a person who takes risks and do crazy things, I think helped him to achieve that. So the only way I think the Saudi royal family, you're talking about the end, I mean, the signs are there. The only way this monarchy would collapse if it eats itself. That's one scenario, and I don't see it. Of course, they are not happy, most of the family, because one guy, MBS, is taken over. But what you have, I think, the easiest way or the most plausible way I see it is some military officers would turn against the ruling family or against MBS in particular and take him out. The murder, I'm working on this report, the murder of the Saudi king's chief bodyguard was part of that palace infighting and competition. And he was murdered because he was working with another part of the ruling family. And you would see in the next few weeks, you would see some repercussion of that, because they have killed the sort of the messenger between the king and these some princes. When you see some princes being offed or suddenly dead, and that would show you that this was the reason that Mr. Al-Fahm, the chief bodyguard, was killed as well. So in terms of having sort of a popular revolution to overthrow the monarchy, I don't see it. mean, that would be ideal, but we don't see it because the country is big and it's not united. You have different regions, but it doesn't mean that there will not be revolts or popular uprising. There will be a popular uprising, especially in the eastern part, and this will I think will come to fruition when things start to go south in terms of stability of the Saudi government. And it is very fragile. I think sometimes fragile things stay stable for a long time, but then when they fall, everything falls very quickly. So
All right.
I don't think that they will survive. You know why? Because this model of government is not sustainable at this time and age. We are beyond an absolute monarchy that decides everything for you. People, what you eat, what you read, what time to go to bed, and how do you worship, and which TV you watch, or which website you access. That is not sustainable at this time and age.
It's still going on, and with American help, which is
It's propped, without being propped by Western powers. This monarchy would have gone 50 years ago.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. I want to just ask you about the bodyguard. When was he murdered, and how close was he to the king? Did they have a good personal relationship? It was many years that he was together with him.
Abdulaziz al-Fagham was the closest person to King Salman, and he was also the chief bodyguard of King Abdullah for a long time. So since 2002, he has been close to King Abdullah, then became his chief bodyguard. Then he moved after King Abdullah died, and he was a loyal, very strong, loyal. He came from the National Guard, which basically is a cult for King Abdullah. So they have a lot of admiration and respect for him. And when King Abdullah died, King Salman took him as his chief bodyguard as well. So that was unusual, but because Al-Fagham came from the National Guard to the Royal Guard, and that has because King Abdullah did not trust the Royal Guard that was developed by his brothers, half-brothers, the Sudaris. So he needed to bring his own people. And Fagham was one of them. But King Salman carried on that role, got Al-Fagham, who became popular in some Saudis as strong and tall and protector of the king. So in our information indicates that he was a conduit that was used by some members of the royal family. He was loyal to parts of the old Saudi regime, like King Abdullah, his children, and some other wings in the ruling family. And he was transmitting messages from and to King Salman to these people. Because King Salman, I'll give you something no one heard about before, but we have confirmed it. King Salman, last year when Khashoggi was murdered, when the information about his murder came out around mid-October, it took King Salman 11 days to be told that Jamal Khashoggi, King Salman knows who he is very well, was killed at the consulate. So 11 days it took. So because king is isolated, he's not, he doesn't have his full capacity. You can tell when he starts talking, for example, you cannot make sense of anything he says. And his age, obviously, and his dementia is setting in. So he was not told. He doesn't have that stability to give orders or to control his son. His son is the decider. But they were hoping that the king would do something. And MBS knew of this, found out of this, and that was the reason that he took the decision. Our information, I'm hoping to finish the report today, but he was not killed on the day that they said he was killed. And we will show that in the report. To us, it's very clear that he was murdered by MBS, and he is in a way similar to Khashoggi, meaning that the reason Khashoggi was murdered, not because, some people say he called for freedom of expression, all that, because he was working on behalf of one side of the monarchy against MBS. and he was defending one side of the monarchy against MBS, and that's why it is almost like you call it a palace feud. And Khashoggi was caught in the middle, being working for one side, and he was killed. Al-Fahm here also, I think he was murdered for the same reason, according to the sources we have.
Well, Ali, that's quite interesting. So are there only two factions? And was the bodyguard on the same faction with the princes who were put in the Ritz-Carlton? Which, of course, Khashoggi was part of that. One of his princes sponsoring him had been imprisoned, correct, in the hotel. So are there only two factions? There's only one going against MBS, and he felt he had to kill this bodyguard? I mean, that's a bit extreme, isn't it?
The Saudi ruling family is so huge. There's not only two factions. You
Right.
have the children of Abdullah, and they have the children of King Faisal, Khalid al-Faisal, who is close to King Salman, and he may be the person that was using Al-Fahm as a conduit. You have also MBN, who has been, and it showed that he is close to Al-Fahm family. He in fact went to the family to give condolences, and he requested permission to be allowed to leave his house arrest, and because he's under house arrest. This is the former Saudi crown prince that was toppled, and so he went to the house to give condolences, and he has connections to, or Al-Fahm has connections to him. So you're talking either MBN or Khalid al-Faisal, who are the people who are trying to get MBS dislodged, and that effort accelerated after the attacks on Abqaiq, because the Abqaiq facility is the crown jewel of Saudi Arabia's oil industry. So when this happened, it drove many members of the ruling family to worry that MBS is bringing them down, and they accelerated their attempt to take action. And Al-Fahm, who tried, I think, his loyalties are not with MBS. He's loyal to the king and to other members of the ruling family.
So on the one hand, it looks like he's pretty, given what's happened a year ago, he's pretty solidly and still in control. That's on one hand. On the other hand, he's murdering people everywhere in order to stay in power. So that shows a sign of weakness as well. If you have to continuously murder people in order to stay in power, that's not a very solid foundation, is it?
MBS, he is in power. He is firmly in control, but at the same time, he is terrified, and he doesn't trust people around him. And he has a personality since he was a child, in fact, that it's more violent. And I spoke to a palace insider who actually saw MBS when he was 5 years old, and saw how he was like a violent child as a child. It didn't make any sense. At 5 years of age, he was basically coming and destroying everything in the room, like he said, without reason. So he was not a well-behaved child, and I think because he was the first child of a favorite wife of King Salman, he had this problem. His own mother, years ago, she told King Salman, her husband, that your son is crazy. He has a mental problem, and that drove MBS to put his own mother under house arrest as well. So he has that type of personality that becomes angry. He has himself beaten people with his own hands, including his wife. But I'm talking about people who were during King Abdullah's time. He slapped the secretary of King Abdullah. He threatened the judge to shoot a judge, a chief judge in Saudi Arabia. So you are looking at a person who does not like people opposing him, or or speaking against him, and that explains his behavior. He didn't like what happened in Yemen, so he waged a war. and he puts everybody in jail, takes very swift action. And that, I think, is reflected by his own upbringing. Sometimes his size gives him that assurance that he can do these things. And hasn't been any reaction from the United States for his war on Yemen or his kidnapping of Lebanese prime minister. I think the only time he basically was shown that, you're not that tough guy, when the Abqaiq attacks happened. Either Iran was behind it directly or the Yemeni forces did it. That was, I think, a wake-up call for him. He may change his ways, I have no idea, but he is not on the verge of collapse. He is unstable, yes, but I don't think it's going to be months. Even it's not that close for him.
I want to get to the attacks on the oil installations, but can you think of any figure in Saudi history, as short as it is, that who was like Mohammed bin Salman?
No. None of this. See, Saudi Arabia was established, by King Abdulaziz, and King Abdulaziz was a violent guy. But he was also very shrewd and very. He's not it's not the type of a person who's angry. MBS is probably the first, you can call him, ruler who has the traits of. He was this young. This is the youngest ruler. Beside King Abdulaziz, this is the youngest ruler, and has more wealth, and he controls more power than even his grandfather, founder of Saudi Arabia, ever had. So this youth, this power and support from the United States and the UK is very important. I think all pushed him into becoming this violent, careless leader that sometimes is working against his own interest. And I predict that he will continue to do that because there hasn't been much repercussion for his actions or his way of acting. You may see some things that happening from Yemen or through Iran that will calm him down or restrain him, but I don't see it coming in the next few weeks, for example.
I saw that attack on the oil installations, a major attack that shut down half their production, as a big punch in the nose to a bully. The Iranian and the Houthis calculated, I think, that there would not be a response from Saudi Arabia or the United States militarily, because the U.S. knows what a catastrophe a war against Iran would be to their own interests and certainly to the people in the entire Gulf region. So they saw an opening there. And we have to see this in the context of who started the war. The Saudis started the war in Yemen, and this was part of the war. I mean, Pompeo said this was an act of war. Yes, there was a war going on, so it was an act of war. But they, of course, in the West, the American press is portraying it as some out-of-the-blue terrorist attack by a bunch of crazy Iranians, rather than as a battle in a larger war begun by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Am I right? Did they calculate that the U.S. basically and the Saudis are essentially powerless to respond to this attack?
I believe so. I did in 2008 write a 70-plus page report about the threats to Saudi oil installation, and Abqaiq was the central part. And this is before drones, and one of the scenarios we ran is the fact that if there's any war or sort of a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the first target would be Abqaiq, because this is where most of the oil is being processed, and it's in a small geographical area. It's very easy to hit, and it's not far from Iran with their ballistic missiles. They were not hit by ballistic missiles, but drones and cruise missiles. But the effect was there. The Americans cannot respond in the same way, because if there is an all-out war, the oil industry there are other targets that we put in our report that could be hit easily and will be destroyed, and it will put Saudi Arabia in complete meltdown. For example, and this is my area, this is where I grew up, so I know it so well. We have, my hometown is surrounded by all these oil installations, and we know it. I have been into many of them. And if Iran hits the Jubail area, which has the largest water desalination plant that also generates electricity, that's called Ghazlan plant. That means that Riyadh has not a drop of water to drink. And you cannot rebuild this in like in a week or two, especially if you hit it with a ballistic missile. And you have you have Jubail industrial compound or city that has about 15, 19 different chemical plants. And they could be hit in one shot, even in a barrage, and that would be destroyed. And you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of loss. Just these two targets will take Saudi Arabia off. They will not have electricity. Riyadh has electricity comes from Jubail. Riyadh's water, that 465 kilometer pipe that goes from Jubail all the way to Riyadh. You can drive a car in that pipe. It's so huge, and if that plant is hit, then Riyadh has no water. That's 5 million residents. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to get water from? So you are looking at a very devastating scenario, even if there was a limited attack, even if the Americans come with their full force, which they don't have in the Gulf. So this scenario of war is only being pushed by people who are either completely ignorant of the aftermath and the repercussions, or people who would like to see that land destroyed and the people killed, because you're talking about massive human loss if a war starts, including the entirety of my family, because this is where we grew up. This is the Ras Tanura oil terminal, the largest in the world, is in my hometown. So if they hit it, my family will be wiped out with not by bombs, but by poisonous smoke. And pipelines are everywhere. We drive over them basically every day. So you are looking at a disastrous outcome of any war. So no, I think I will give Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump as well credit for saying, "Oh, we should talk." It took an attack on Abgaig, but the best way for all parties here is to end these wars and talk, because there is a lot of commonality or common goals between the Saudis and the Iranians in the region, and they can do it. They can work it out. It's better for everyone, even for the Americans.
Ali, you're talking about your family, but you're living here in the Washington area. I assume you cannot go back. Can you give us a little bit of the background of your family and what happened to them when they tried to protest?
Well, I am here in forced exile. Cannot go back, and my nationality was taken away without even my knowledge. I just found out incidentally. So I'm stateless. The Americans will not give me citizenship because the Saudis talk to them about it, and they, in fact, the American system has been trying to kind of tie my hands so I don't write and I don't speak. So this is before Khashoggi, before the Saudis kept trying to bring me in many ways, including trying to get the Americans to do it. And I was lucky that these attempts were unsuccessful. There was an active attempt by the US government to kind of find something that they can sort of invalidate my asylum. They couldn't, because I don't have any record or legal activity. And so there was a lot of scrutiny, a lot of preventing me from getting a work permit, travel document, which can completely in violation of US laws, by the way. And this was done from the top up. I can tell you Robert Mueller was involved in it himself. I found out through allies in the government when he was head of the FBI. And then, of course, the Saudi attempts to spy, to infiltrate, to kidnap continued until, and to hack. The hacking continued until recently. I have no idea if they will continue to try to hack me, but I have been approached by members of the royal family. I met with the Saudi king brother, who was at the time the head of the intelligence. His name is Mugren. We met here in the Ritz-Carlton in Tassin Corner. I met with him and his deputy, and their request to try to convince me to go back. They wanted me to go on the plane, but you don't see that in the media, because the American media, they don't want to talk about it. They want to talk about somebody else. So there was those attempts. There was those spying attempts, and there we have evidence to all of that. By the way. So there we have conclusive, irrefutable evidence. So these are not claims. What you can see here is they didn't like a voice that's independent, that wanted actually something modern, and the United States as a guarantor of the survivability of the Saudi monarchy joined in. And I was told that by I remember I had a talk with Philip Mudd, who was CIA and FBI, and he told me point blank, we support the Saudi royal family against anyone, domestic or foreign. I said, even human rights advocates. He said, absolutely. So it's not about so-called terrorists and so on. So that has been the case, and that's the reality. People don't want to hear it, they don't want to hear it, but that's the reality. And my family has been through a lot since decades now. My direct family, I'm not talking about my uncle who was in jail in the 60s and my other uncle who was in jail in the 90s. Talking about me when my entire family was arrested in the 80s. And then my younger brother spent now over 20 years in prison, my youngest brother. And my nephew now has been in jail for almost 8 years for protest and so on. And my brother will, if the Saudi regime continues to survive, will be in prison for the next 13, 14 years. He got a 17-year sentence for protesting. And he had already spent 8 years prior in prison. He was tortured, everything, the whole package. He has not been able to have a life, really. There's a lot of restriction in the family and harassment and so on. So all my brothers have been to prison. My own mother, my father, all political prisoners. So this is just a microcosm of what many families in my country go through. And it's because of me sometimes, it's because just the way the system is. But because of, I am in DC, I've been vocal, and I've been, I have basically been on US mass media or mainstream media. That was very, they made the Saudis very angry, and they tried, and they continue, by the way. You can notice, for example, I was on all the American shows, all the mainstream media, but in the past few years, that was all cut off because there was an attempt, there was a campaign, secretive campaign against me with people, with people in CNN, with all the major news network, not to get this person, me, on TV. I was the person they go to. Look at the Washington Post, for example. I'm actually the only journalist. I went to journalism school. I have a journalism degree. I have worked in journalism. I have done reports, investigations, and I've written. I've been here in Washington since 2001, and I've done a lot of credible reports. But the Washington Post has not interviewed me once about after Khashoggi was killed. You would think that would be the natural thing. I submitted an article about my experience. This is before we knew Khashoggi was actually dead. So, and I said, you know, I feel the same because I have been through this, ABC, and here are the evidence. They refuse to publish it. They're not the only one, by the way. So that's a product of a campaign, and that's very common to silence voices. And I'm not the only one. I just happen to be here a long time. So I've known how, when I had access, and now I don't have that access because somebody came and said, here is money, or, you know, gave them the wrong impression, and they, instead of coming back to me, they didn't do it. In 2014, for example, I gave the Washington Post an exclusive report that I worked on for a year, investigative report showing Saudis who were in the United States. We showed pictures, names, locations, everything. How they were here in the United States as Saudi students brought and sponsored by the Saudi government, who left the United States and joined ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. When I told the reporter in the Washington Post, I have this information, if you would like it, or I'll publish it. She said, please don't publish it. So we spent months going back and forth on it, and then they decided not to publish it. The decision was not to publish anything. This was basically us exposing the largest foreign nationality that were in the United States and joined ISIS, which is a huge story, you would think. But the Washington Post killed it because it came from us. And because I think the CIA or the FBI didn't want that story to come out. And that's exactly what happened. So you see that there are limitations about independent journalism, like what we do. And then we will show in the next weeks and months other exclusive information. We'll see if the mass or mainstream media will pick it up. And it's very good stories. I hope you will cover it.
Well, we're certainly open to that, Ali. Anything you want to throw our way, and it's no surprise that that's how the Washington Post reacted to that, especially if there was a U.S. complicity in this, or at least turning a blind eye to these guys.
And what we know in that report, by the way, that the U.S. government, at least because one of the things we did is we tried to test if they knew. Well, some of the people, not I wouldn't say all, but some of the people who were supposed to have known about it, they did not. The State Department, for example, they did not know about this. Yeah, and that kind of showed that the Saudi government knew, and they did not share it with the Americans, or it was part of a deal. I cannot really tell you, but they were shocked when we kind of tested the water. If they had any information, and we showed it to them, they were shocked.
Well, as long as there's this very close relationship between American presidents and the foreign policy establishment here and the royal family, they'll have their back, and their rule seems secure. Of course, there's so much money being thrown the other way here, and that's the basis of it. Think tanks, companies, newspapers, you name it, who are dependent on Saudi money. That's still the corrupt relationship. But there's one other element here, and it's so hard to get our hands on a feel for what's going on here in the West anyway. And that is the thinking of the population in Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of people in your country, your former country, who are not rich, like say in Qatar, where they all are, or the other Gulf monarchies. There's a huge unhappy part of the Saudi population. How do we know how they're thinking? There are no real public opinion polls. And that has to be the greatest fear, that at some point, having seen the other rebellions in the region in the last decade or so, that this will happen in Saudi Arabia. What can you tell us about the current feeling amongst the population towards this ruling family?
The population is very clear, and that is demonstrated by a few things that, again, like the Washington Post refused to talk about. And I remember in 2015, when the last Saudi or the elections for partial elections for the Saudi municipal councils, where finally the Saudis allowed women to vote and run for office. And I remember this discussion with with the Washington Post reporter who was dispatched from here to Riyadh, Brian Murphy. He ended up being the chief editor for Middle East, but I think he has left since. And when he, they had a very good story, very positive story about the Saudi election, historical election, they call it. They never said these councils have no power, have zero power. They're just councils that they don't do anything. They don't have appropriation. They don't make decisions. That part of the story was not included in any story. The number two and very important indicator, only 5% of eligible voters took part in these elections. There was basically a boycott of these elections. That again did not make it to the Washington Post or other Western media. They said they told a small part of the story where women were allowed to vote and run for office. You saw there. I remember one of the women who was elected. She was elected by 2 votes, her votes and her husband's votes. That was how much people. This boycott tells you how the people in the country feel about the Saudi government. This is a great indicator of how we feel. But an indicator that we always say to pro-Saudi, either American, Saudis themselves or outsiders, they say, "Oh, the Saudi family is very popular. People want this." And I said, "Well, if that's the case, why are you not allowing the people to prove that? Why don't you let them choose who run the country? Will they pick King Salman or al-Ahmed or somebody else?" So it is generally we can tell from experience and from contacts that the majority of the population are opposed to the ruling family. They might not have ability to voice it because of restrictions and oppression, or they think that it's too risky for them to do. But I have not seen many Saudis that we meet come to the United States or we talk to who are supportive of the monarchy. Everybody's looking beyond the monarchy. What's keeping the monarchy in power is it's that Western support and their ability to purchase supercomputers to monitor everything. And there is a video of that we just serviced recently of them bragging about that we can find out everything that you write, and we have a relationship with these social media companies that we can get information on. And that's very, very true, because every week we see Twitter and other media or other social media companies killing accounts or tweets, and they just killed an account yesterday that's just basically talking about victims of execution and victim of arrest in the Eastern Province without any. I had my Arabic account, which has 35,000, and a verified account killed without reason, without explanation, and with a warning that do not try to open another account. You have that support that's keeping the family in power. Without that support, you will see how weak and how unpopular the ruling family and the monarchy in general. It's not people's, what you see even now after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, they talk about the MBS as he's the only evil in that country or in that family. It's not. It is what I like to call, and I will write an article with that title. It is the monarchy stupid. Monarchy are bad for us. Monarchy is basically a group of people, a mafia that is pillaging an entire country. Any sort of elitist type of system does that. It's just the nature of life.
I would think that Mohammed bin Salman understands the unpopularity of himself and the family, which helps inform his psychology of paranoia, of weakness, of lashing out, of having to murder and stay in power through spilling blood. It's worthy of Shakespeare. Ali, thank you so much for joining us today and having the courage to continue to speak out on this issue, knowing the dangers that are out there. And I do appreciate you came on CN Live to share this time with us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay. This is CN Live.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
We're going to be able to contribute some serious money